If you are a real reader who seeks to transform their reality through reading classic literature, then this video is for you because today I am talking about the big classics, the ambitious classics, the classics that are hard to read. And I've had my life changed with a singular Robinson Jeffers poem or a novelist poem. And so you don't need a 500,000 word novel to change someone's life. But the novel really steps into itself and really becomes better than any artistic medium when you have a beautiful captain behind the pen who can take you for hundreds of thousands of words on this journey. Film, TV shows, no other artistic medium can go as deep as a 400 or 500,000 word classic novel can do. And so today I'm going to tell you guys which ones you should be reading, because if you are going to sit down and dedicate 30 hours of your life to a book, then you don't want to pick the wrong book, because I hate having to give up on a book. All that time wasted, all the open loops that will remain forever in your head, the lies you will tell when someone says, "Did you read Moby Dick?" And you have to say, yeah, I read that. When you actually stopped when Melville just started listing the inventory of the whaling ship. And if you do not already know, my name is Ian, and here on Right Conscious, we talk about the best books and the best authors of all time. I also am helping writers create a literary renaissance so we can stand on the shoulders of the great classic authors that I am going to be talking about today. And so if you guys know me, you guys already know where I am taking this ship. We have to talk about, first and foremost, Moby Dick, the Weaver God, the Gnostic classic, the dark look into metaphysics and our existential quest. So the first thing I have to talk about when it comes to Moby Dick is Melville stepping into the role of being next in line in terms of the beauty, the magnificence of the King James Bible. Melville and then Faulkner and Cormac McCarthy sit in this lineage where they looked at the Bible as literature and maybe also as a book of revelation and of truth, but they continued that tradition through their literature, and not just with the symbols and the parables and whatnot, but also with the style that the Bible was written in. And funny enough, Moby Dick is so great because Melville doesn't just draw from the Bible like maybe Dostoevsky did. He also doubled down and drew from Shakespeare. If you read Moby Dick and you are well acquainted with Hamlet and Macbeth, you will find references and stuff that Melville stole everywhere throughout the novel. And with the novel that comes in at 215,000 words, and in a time where access to mass amounts of paperback wasn't a thing, then of course Shakespeare was going to be a huge influence. But I feel like an author who's going to sit down and write a 215,000 word novel has to have that weight behind him, because, guys, Moby Dick will take most people probably around 15 hours to finish, 10 to 15 hours depending on the person if they are actually reading it, if not longer. And as a writer, that's what you are asking someone to do when you give them your novel. If I said right now, hey, look at my poem, and you look at it and it's 10 lines, you'll probably read it because it will take you 30 seconds. But if I say, read this novel, what I'm asking you is for a 10 to 15 hour commitment. And what I talk about on this channel all the time is that if you're going to ask someone of that, then you need to give them something in return, whether that's totally entertaining them or totally transforming them. And so standing on the shoulders of someone who is great enables you not to get lost in the ego, because many great novels that I've read and many amateur novels that I've read are too ambitious. Think that they can sustain over this long period of time this rapid intensity. And most of the classic novels that we'll be talking about today fall into similar traps. As I mentioned earlier, if you sit down and you read Moby Dick, and I am your guide, I am your motivator right now. I am here to not just help you put the book on your shelf, but to help you finish this damn book. And I'm going to tell you, there's going to be some whaling inventory sections. There's going to be some sections of this that are going to be a little bit tough to read. And I first read this novel when I worked as a security guard at the Venetian Convention Center, which was the most boring job in the world. And I do the graveyard shift and just pound some caffeine and blow through some classic novels. And what first stuck out to me was Captain Ahab's will, his determination. If you remember correctly, even though this isn't a philosophical correspondence or even reality in any way, over in Russia, over in Germany, Dostoevsky, Nietzsche, all the other 19th century philosophers had already written or were writing these works that started to really examine the will. If you look at German idealism and how that influenced psychology, and how at some level the conscious mind was called will before we called it the conscious mind or whatever in psychology, it was a huge deal in the 19th century. And so of course, Melville was going to start grappling with this and going out and whaling, especially at this time, being a learned man and going on this whaling ship and also having this kind of inner genetic darkness, because I don't think you can write something like this and be so ahead of the time and so tapped into this without that genetic component, But Melville being able to tap into this helped him deal with kind of the complexity of the figures and the ambitious scope of the novel. And Melville, much like Faulkner and Cormac McCarthy, at times could avert direct narrative and characterization in many of these things when we watch WritingTube that we're told to do by forcing us to be this kind of outward meditator and observer of the novel. Because what's interesting is that many of the great books behind me do somewhat push a philosophy. They do try to talk about some truth in the world or show this kind of symphony of truths, but then ask us to kind of step into this. But Melville transcends this kind of idea of just existing and creating moral ambiguity with characters. Is Tony Soprano good or bad? And steps into the realm of poetry, because when I read the great poets, Rilke, Novalis, Holderlin, whoever, Emily Dickinson, I don't know, I don't necessarily reflect on the truthfulness or the literalness of their work. Most of the time, I'm in a different state of mind, working with the idea of metaphor and meditating on these concepts, sometimes sitting for a minute or a couple minutes after reading a poem and just kind of letting it hit me. And when you read Melville the right way, which I didn't the first time, when I first read Moby Dick, I just wanted to check it off. You know, I probably saw a video like this back in the day. It was probably more likely a blog post, or I just constantly heard about Melville. I think I've really started hearing about him from Robert Anton Wilson. But when you read it right, and who I can't tell you how to read it right, but when I really feel like I'm understanding it the most, I'm doing these kind of deep meditations and finding this kind of unraveling within the novel. And that's why I love that Melville, talks about the Weaver God, but, we can get into that in a second. I also love this novel because I'm very much into Gnosticism. I am not a Gnostic. I love, I'll talk about Gnosticism and Christians will be like, you're just a Gnostic, right, Conscious? You believe in a dead religion. I'm like, dude, I can talk about the LDS Church, Gnosticism, Buddhism, Hinduism at depth and not need to believe in it. It's crazy. Anyway, so it's a new day, but I want to show you guys a quote from Ahab that I think really shows his Gnostic philosophy, because I could do a whole video on Moby Dick's Gnostic clues, but that would take way too long right now. So here is a really good one. I own thy speechless, placeless power, but to the last gasp of my earthquake, life will dispute its unconditional, unintegral mastery in me. Oh, thou clear spirit, of thy fire thou madest me, and like a true child of fire, I breathe it back to thee. So Ahab isn't a atheist or a conventional theist, and for many people in time immemorial, that meant that they got pushed more into more of a Gnostic ideology, or kind of the Gnostic concept of revolt, where you reject any allegiance to the demiurge or the illusionary reality that the demiurge created and kind of acknowledge the darkness and pointlessness of this world, except when you are trying to draw yourself upward with gnosis. And Melville actually wrote a poem about Gnosticism, fragments of a lost Gnostic poem of the 12th century, where he said, matter in end will never abate his ancient brutal claim. And so when you look at Moby Dick or Blood Meridian and many of the great Gnostic novels from a Gnostic lens, it transforms them into not just a story about whaling that's somewhat metaphysical and you can see the biblical references, or a Western story with some biblical references, but into a contemplation of the human condition from the shadow, more existential point of view that was repressed all throughout antiquity. And it's a good time to mention that that's one of the biggest weaknesses of the reading community in general, especially the literary fiction community, because there are plenty of you guys out there who are Christians, and that is great. But if you were raised Christian like I was, and you read the Bible, or you've come to it later and started to research, well, if that's your main frame, like if that is maybe the only thing in your entire life that you've researched deeply and it's your only referent, then you're going to see everything through that. The thinker thinks what the prover proves. And the big fallacy with it all is that to understand different points of view means that in general, you're going to have to leave behind your literal belief in Christianity to be able to understand Gnosticism, Buddhism, Hinduism, Jungianism. I could just go on, but those require you, if you want to go fully into them, dropping the initial set of beliefs, which is very problematic for people who believe that this is a heaven or hell paradox. And so it's not wrong to come at Moby Dick or Blood Meridian or whatever other novel from a Christian perspective. That's fine. But I've personally found that the deeper you go, the more you realize that these authors weren't coming at the book from that angle and actually had infused in up to 10 different core philosophies within their work, almost as this kind of hermetic code. And it's actually really good writing because it actually enables you to draw a wider group of people in. For instance, I know people who are more on the atheist side of things, and when they read Blood Meridian, they feel like they are having their kind of ideology reinforced, even if it's kind of showing a malignant aspect. Kind of, they really enjoy the will to power stuff. Then I know Christians who are kind of inspired by Blood Meridian and see it as, devil incarnate on earth. But if you look at, other novels, maybe that ones that aren't talked about enough as much, do they do that for the reader? Can they find almost anyone and activate something within them? Another cool part of this story is, and like I said, I don't think I'm really going to spoil any books, is the relationship between Queequeg and Ishmael in the story. And it was almost a preview by Melville, and I think obviously many people knew where this was heading, of the racial problems in America. And I've heard it said before, and I don't know if this is true, that, Ahab's obsession with the white whale, there's many theories of, what it exactly means, but it's somewhat of a metaphor of us not trying to necessarily integrate with the new world, with people like Queequeg, with the new waves of immigrants wherever they are from. And also of our racial problem that, as we can see today, is still manifesting. And so we will end it there with Moby Dick, and we will move on to the next classic that you need to read. So, of course, your boy had to do it. War and Peace has to be on this list. And I could do other Tolstoy works, but War and Peace is very ambitious and very unfinished. And when most people approach War and Peace, I think they hear videos like this, and they know it's going to be complex. But I think they think it's going to be like Dostoevsky, but like more of an exploration of aristocratic life. But instead, I think that War and Peace is really just a 500,000 word meditation on the dialect of freedom and necessity. And how Tolstoy explores this isn't through characters. Sometimes he has what scholars call the theoretical chapters, where he will almost do a philosophical essay in the middle of the novel exploring such and such idea. And it's all kind of carrying us toward this idea of, are we free in our decisions, or are we basically slaves to historical inevitability? I recently taught my English classes Into the Wild by John Krakauer about Chris McCandless, who died up in Alaska, and he was a big Tolstoyan and was always quoting him, and seems like really was trying to push this idea of being free and breaking free from society and all like the historical influences to really actually have free will, but it's sad, I should say. It's not funny, it's sad how he ended up. And one of the things that kind of upholds this idea of free will, especially as men, is of course the great man theory. And like that, talking about that requires a whole other video. But I pulled a quote from Tolstoy in book 10, chapter 28, when he's talking about Napoleon entering Moscow. And he says, quote, all his painstaking efforts and ideas were directed toward himself. And all he did and said looked merely to satisfy his own vanity. The whole world seemed to him centered upon himself. And what Tolstoy does brilliantly, in the novel is, for example, give us more internal stuff like that, that's showing kind of maybe a narcissistic or whatever point of view, and then later show a battle where Napoleon seems to be giving commands, but in actuality, the battle is just happening on its own, and the tactics and what the generals think and are trying to do actually mean nothing. And like any great writer, Tolstoy puts his ideas into practice with these moments of revelation. You know, sometimes Hemingway would write entire chapters just waiting for a scene, this ambiance, as I talked about in my ranking Hemingway's video. And small spoiler that doesn't really matter. One of the characters in the novel, Prince Andrew, gets wounded in a battle. And as he's reflecting on it all, this is what he thinks. Above him, there was nothing now but the sky, the lofty sky, not clear yet still immeasurably lofty, with gray clouds gliding slowly across it. How quiet, peaceful, and solemn. How was it I did not see that lofty sky before? And how happy I am to have found it at last. And that's one of the strengths of this novel, is Tolstoy's characterization. Him being able to pull certain characters, like we just saw, from maybe not believing into believing, but back at them. But then on the journey, much like us, they are growing in terms of their consciousness and experience. And it's somewhat hard to get that in a novel. But if you have 500,000 words, you have the ability to kind of explore that. And what's nice about this is that it's kind of unified. So like another 500,000 word modern novel that's right behind me there is Infinite Jest. And Infinite Jest does have a lot of unified themes, but it's really kind of exploring like 3 or 4 main things, in my opinion, that are all connected and important. But there are way too many characters and the timeline's broken, so it's sometimes harder to locate what's actually being said and where these kind of revelations or these growth moments are happening. And Wallace and many postmodernists kind of flip this Tolstoyan optimism and ping-ponging on its head and just send characters into de-evolution. And so I could go on and on about Pierre's journey, but I don't want to spoil anything. And so I would say that this is worth it. I will have to make a video on how to read this and how to motivate you to get through this. Maybe I'll have to do a book club on this. But Tolstoy, for sure, is one of the better ambitious novelists to read, whether it's this novel or one of his others. And so let's get out of Russia, because obviously I'm going to talk about Dostoevsky at some point. And so next I have the Count of Monte Cristo on this list. And this one probably should have been before War and Peace, but I got so excited because this is about the books that will transform you and that are important, but that you can also get through. War and Peace may be a bit of a struggle for a lot of people. And so that's what makes the Count of Monte Cristo so important to me, is that it is a 19th century novel. It is a classic novel, but it's very long. It comes in around 450,000 words, but it's pretty easy to read. There are some slogs at times, but it is going to be one of these books that you read and get through, and you're going to be able to give yourself a pat on the shoulder, and it will increase your reading momentum. It will increase your confidence and your skills and help you maybe transition to reading War and Peace or some of the other novels that are harder or more ambitious. But just because it's not as hard doesn't mean it doesn't have as much transformative and philosophical value. And much like Tolstoy, one of the main themes of this novel is free will, fate, and of course, justice and the limits of justice. Because contemplating, if there's any part of the government and all of that, which is the most mind-blowing to contemplate, it is the judicial system and its function and its role. Because if you want to, for instance, create, let's say, an anarchist society or a communist society, or a politically extreme society, one of the more odd parts of that is, how is the judicial branch going to work? And how do you transition a country, let's say, that has a strong and historical judicial branch and public servants to an entirely new system? And as you guys have maybe seen, we've been struggling with that concept in America, not just over the past couple months, but for years now. And when I first read this, and maybe this was my, perspective back when I was younger, which it was, but it made me kind of reinforce this idea of, can humans really do justice upon each other? Is this possible with all of our fallibility, error, emotion, and how much of our judicial system is just based entirely on hubris, on tradition? And so that's a whole other conversation. But anybody contemplating those ideas, I think it's really good for you. It's okay if you need to peace out and not care about politics for years or keep it on the back burner. But you should be always contemplating a lot of the stuff, whether it's even in history, so that when it comes time or there is a moment where you do need to engage with what's happening in the modern world, you are equipped to do it. And so what also makes the Count of Monte Cristo really good is that it is based more on a classic Greek tragedy. Even though it's long, it's because it was serialized. And serialized works can just go on and on and on. And one of the main themes, I won't spoil anything here, is this kind of positive note of moving away from revenge, moving away from fate. One of the things that happens with fate that I think is shown a lot through the Greeks and through just our everyday life is that if you try to be this player in the game, that if you really try and put yourself out there, that's when you get ensnared by fate, for better or for worse. If you're an NPC or opt out, or maybe even take a whole other point of view, maybe renounce yourself or whatever, then you can maybe avoid some of that. But in general, it feels like, for me and many other people I know who are actually connected to themselves, that if they are really pushing the envelope, it feels like you were just walking this path that's already been laid out before you. But sometimes that path is to help you contemplate some of these things that you hold so dear, some of these staples of human society. We have been, I would say, given some really good anti-programming on revenge. I think many of us, through countless movies and stuff that probably have an axiomatic base in the Count of Monte Cristo, understand that, seeking revenge too far eventually leads to kind of a corrosive quality of life and of the mind. And it's interesting because I don't know if back in time immemorial, if this idea of revenge was just fictionalized and, always talked about in books, or if it was a real thing that someone would say, because, in today's society, we have all this stuff to live for. You don't want to make the news, and people get revenge all the time. Luigi Mangione or whatever his name is. But it feels like if I was living in 1850 and someone did something to me, that I could center my whole life on getting revenge and finding that person. I like that in Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five. He kind of plays with this idea. Who is it? Lazaro eventually wants to come back and kill Billy Pilgrim. But once you start contemplating these big ideals, or like these big things, like, what is my purpose? Because once you remove this concept of revenge, so for most people today, I don't really know anyone that's like fueled totally on revenge. But I do know people who were screwed by their parents and like, guess what? I'm going to be rich, or like, I was raised poor, so I'm going to be so rich. Like, I know a lot of people like that, and that's kind of revenge for their parents giving them this crappy life some of the time, I think. But if you remove, though, these external motivation factors, a lot of the time what you get, and this is what happens in the novel, is this existential or absurd point of view. Suddenly we're dealing with Camus. And a big part of individuating in modern life is finding your own meaning. And that's just the path. That's what I love about the existentialists. Like, okay, we are giving these kind of models for meaning that don't really work and are just, meant to take us so far, or meant for us to get lost in forever. But then you break free from those, then you find your own meaning. But then eventually you're supposed to realize that there is a divine meaning in reality. And, many people never get to that level. And that's why we have, Andrew Huberman optimized bros everywhere, just trying to make a little bit more money and get the house, get the lake house and the boat. Or we have, the eat, pray, love, I'm going to go to Bali and get fucked by my yoga instructor crowd. And that's what's great about these longer novels, is that you can explore this, that we can kind of see the cycle, because eventually that redemption does find itself into the novel through forgiveness and compassion. And he says, one of not no spoilers here, but at the end of the novel, one of the big philosophical revelations is that human wisdom is contained in two words, wait and hope, longing and compassion. Longing, a word that none of us know anymore, with instant gratification. So of course we have to talk about Charles Dickens, and I think that in terms of transformation and contemplation, that Bleak House is the best. I'm actually thinking of a line. I don't know if anybody out here listens to Brownsville Ca, the rapper, but in his song Iron Age with Rock Marciano, he says, "Can't change overnight like Ebenezer." Speaking of transformation, anyway, what I like about Dickens, and I think it's shown especially in this novel, is this idea of being more quiet, humble, practical when it comes to social interactions. Because in this novel, you see how small acts of kindness or small actions can have profound impacts on people. And I think that in our suburban sprawl and disconnected lifestyle, we no longer see this. I sometimes get emails, from people, and they're like, "I'm gonna kill myself, right, Conscious? You ruined my mental health as a writer." And, I don't know how to react to that. And like, that's a whole other conversation. But I get a wide range of emails, from death threats to, which is crazy because all we do is talk about literature, to "you changed my life for the positive." But as a teacher, I've also had students, whose lives I've changed. It blew my mind one time that years ago when I was in Vegas, I didn't have this one student, but they would occasionally come in with their friends, like to talk at lunch or to ask questions. And I saw this guy years later, and this was long before I had a YouTube channel. And he told me that I got him into reading, then reading helped, change his life, and like yada, yada, yada. And his life took a totally different trajectory because how I, in a couple conversations in my class, while I wasn't even talking to him, but talking to his friends, it created that type of impact. And then when you start, it will knock your head off if you start contemplating how connected your life is to everyone, and how small acts of kindness or meanness, for lack of a better word in my mind right now, contribute to a certain direction in your life. And a lot of this is connected to, so as I was talking about earlier, something that happens when you're the Huberman optimized bro, where I'm trying to read all the classics as fast as I can. When you start to become too optimized and you start living for the future or living for a checklist and losing awareness, more importantly, losing mindfulness, what happens is you start to postpone happiness. You start to postpone cherishing the present moment for these dreams, for this hypothetical future. And many great tragedies, behind me explore that idea. But Dickens was kind of one of the early masters at showing this. And the way that you have to, everything I'm saying here, I'm sure sounds nice, but what you have to do is be able to transcend logic, be able to transcend pessimism and these things if you want to be able to experience this. Because it's easy to be seduced into the idea that there is no objective morality. And in actuality, there probably isn't. It's easy to be seduced away from guiding principles and standards for your own reality, and to hopefully show other, share with others. That's the easy way out. But to live by principles, to share those principles and speak about them and stick to it no matter what, that is one of the more difficult things you can do in life. And that's like just starting the game, that's entering out, that's escaping Tutorial Island and being able to play the game. We have so many people in the world who aren't playing the game, whether because they are in nescience and have no idea of what's going on in terms of all this, or they're just ignorant and they are choosing to be a pessimist. They're choosing to be a little logic bro and not actually connecting with other humans. And if there's no humans around them, you guys, the easiest hack in the world is that if there are no other humans around you that are cool and can connect with you, it means that you have to improve yourself so that you become more desirable for the people who are cool to want to hang out with. Right now, because what I've done with this channel and what I've done in my real life, I have access to more people who are cool than I would ever know what to do with. In 2 years, I have more friends than I could ever handle. But I got to that point through self-improvement first, by being more optimistic and hopefully showing kind. And this is the real social justice, because like we hear like the word social justice all the time, and it's also become this thing that's so disconnected from us. I don't want to be drawn into whatever conflict that I'm being told to care about this year. Oh, what's your opinion on Ukraine or Palestine and Israel? And it's like, dude, there are people dying in random wars in Africa. There are wage slaves on every continent, and we never care or talk about them because there is no monetary or political incentive involved. The same is true in our own country. It's much easier to go protest some random thing or care about some random issue than to actually fix your own community, to actually get involved and start doing something. And that's what was a crazy thing for me to realize, was that when, for years I was doing nothing. I was doing stuff, and I'm going to be a writer, and I'm going to talk about books online and yoga and all. I knew exactly what I was going to do, but I couldn't get off the ground, and I was working jobs sometimes where I didn't have to work at all, and I was just getting by and living so comfortably, but I could never get anything done. I was getting all this other stuff done. But then when I went back into the world and I became a teacher, when I became this public servant who had to, like the other day, I this is like a daily, if not weekly occurrence. I said, "Hey, Johnny, it's your turn to read." "Fuck you, Mr. Canon. I don't have to do shit. Just have to sit and deal with it." Or, people, I hate you. You're the worst teacher. Just like stuff like that all the time. Dealing with these emotional problems. It's like you want to sometimes just kill yourself. But putting myself out in the world and being a part of my community and living, close to my school and volunteering with other stuff in my town and doing all that, I'm not involved in the politics at all, but I'm involved with the people who live here and influencing the culture of this area. And I think that that's a perspective that most people should have. It's the same, and it's a similar example is traveling. Everyone wants to go check off the next thing on the list instead of understanding their own area, instead of exploring all the valleys around you and really deepening your understanding. The same is true with this idea of social justice. You find your guiding principles first and what you believe in, these core philosophies, and then you put yourself out in your local community, and it's a really healthy thing, man. It's literally what we did for a super long time once we kind of built civilization. I understand that, like, maybe not a nomadic society, but it's a really easy way to find purpose and just get involved with it every single day, even if you don't want to. So enough on all that. Let us now talk about, of course, Don Quixote. And what's so funny about this novel is that I took a creative writing workshop in university, and I had a professor who forced us to read this. So, the creative writing workshop program or ideology has totally shifted. Back in the day, if you were a shit writer, and many people in creative writing programs are, I remember when I first started my first workshop, I think when I was 18, I was releasing some shit, but they would give you an F. I remember I turned in this short story, and I look back at it sometimes, that was an F. Like that, it wasn't good. And if I was given an F, I would have been mad, and I would have either quit and then, hey, I wasn't strong enough, or I would have been like, I need to make this better. But instead, I got this kind of wishy-washy response. Oh, this was good here, a little confusing here. And now there's like a pass-fail system, or like they can't grade you on quality, because like that's, one of the problems with diversity is that, people can claim there's like racism and sexism and like, this is my story, this is my perspective, I know this is right. And, I've heard that, I've seen that personally happen countless times when grades weren't on the line. So if grades were on the line, I could see how that would be a major issue. But I had this workshop professor. This dude was super serious. He treated it like we were in the 1960s and everything was, a grade. And he'd be so disappointed. Like, he couldn't force us to do anything. It was pass fail. If we just showed up and we didn't read or do anything, like we just turned in random shit, he'd have to pass us. And he would like almost yell at us and be disappointed in us. And so this dude made us read Don Quixote for creative writing practice. And then when we'd ask him, hey, why the hell are we reading this? Like, what creative writing tactics can I be learning from this? Like, what can I be imitating? And he said, I want you to wait 5 or 10 years and then you'll know. And he's like, this is axiomatically so important. And, I kind of got it as I was reading it. But a couple months ago over on my Substack, and if you guys don't already know, I run a Substack with the Right Conscious Book Club. I have writing courses, literature courses, my own writing, a bunch of other cool stuff. I try to release over there daily. Anyway, so the link to that is down below. But over there, I have a Cormac McCarthy course that is over 20 hours in length and has like 30 plus hours of like book club calls archived. But I was doing an All the Pretty Horses course video. And at the start of All the Pretty Horses, and actually at the end of The Crossing by Cormac McCarthy, which are kind of Arthurian romances, or one could say Quixotean kind of epics, there was the windmill. But it was the windmill in rune, symbolizing the start of the journey in All the Pretty Horses, and then the end of a journey in The Crossing. And so with that, with that symbol, it made me stop actually. It made me stop and start to contemplate what that meant and what this idea of young absurdity and these young men going down to Mexico for this romantic quest, like what that meant and their absurdity. And it really, it's making me emotional right now. It really created a ton of contemplation. But that level of depth wouldn't have been there if I hadn't had read this novel. And once that happened, there was almost a torrent of other things that started getting connected, to Don Quixote. So that's just a quick aside, but like sometimes reading these things are important for future revelation. Sometimes this slog, sometimes this push into the classics doesn't make sense until later. Same is true with Shakespeare. I've been reading. So currently right now I'm reading multiple Shakespeare plays with multiple of my classes. I don't ever like doing the same lesson with every single class. I do something different in every single class, and I never do something from the same year. From a previous year. It's always fresh because it just entertains me. And so I'm doing like a bunch of Shakespeare plays right now, and having reread them and having to read them out loud and then act them out with the class and then explain them. They're like, what the hell does this mean? And I have to think about it and slow it down. And then we'll watch a movie or the play to reinforce it. It's shown me a lot of stuff that I passed over that I didn't see before. Anyway, and so kind of the main thing that Don Quixote shows you is this idea between the real world versus the imaginative world, because not probably many of us, but maybe some of us have been bogged down by the real world. We've been told to believe in this fake illusionary world. And when someone is outside of that, when someone is a dreamer, when someone has an alien experience or sees giants or whatever, more so than ever, we throw them away, and this is something I've been contemplating in terms of Indian mythology. I've been learning Sanskrit for years, very much into Eastern philosophy. I have a yoga channel, and a scholar named Edwin Bryant talked about that when you go to India, and I experienced this over there, that they don't view their reality as this Platonic or Aristotelian fusion like we view God in, the Christian God in the West. I'm sorry, that was a word salad. But they in the East, they actually believe in God. We've turned God into a metaphor, into a concept. Aquinas, by fusing Aristotle, really cemented that. They don't think that over there, at least not everyone. Like there is a big group of people in India that actually like believe in the mythology. Like they don't believe it's just like a metaphor. It's an archetypal metaphor that we can all experience. Like, no, like this is real. And here in the West, like we really don't have that. And I think that, of course, that can lead on the malignant end to cults and to problems. But in general, those will always exist because guess what? Now we've traded, Jim Jones for the technological cults, for people like, people don't kill themselves with the Kool-Aid anymore. They kill themselves because they got sucked into technology way too deeply. And they kill themselves in mass, 1,000 people dying at Jonestown, or 50, 60 people dying in Heaven's Gate or whatever is nothing compared to the amount of people who've died because of the technology cult. And so being able to live with fantasy, being able to dream and have support or not have support like in Don Quixote is a really important thing. And it doesn't all the time. It can lead to darkness. But like I said, so do most things. But as a society, I would rather choose that than total objectivity. And once again, this novel, I mean, a lot of these novels, are similar in the sense that they make you question and just kind of come back to these core things as humans, friendship, embracing failure, imperfection, these types of things. We all know, we've all heard it before in the motivational video or from our friend when they say a cliche or whatever. But one of the most profound things that I've learned in my journey is that I need to be reprogrammed daily with positivity, with other things. The people that I know who say, I've learned that before, I don't need any of that, are the most backwards ass people that I know. And I'm very close to some people like that who think that they don't need to continuously be consuming whatever type of content that helps them be positive or focus on these core things. Because that you shouldn't be eating red dye 40 and you know that you should be doing X, Y, and Z and you don't. Why not? Why aren't you doing it? Well, you are programmed and conditioned more so on that angle than on the positive angle or on whatever other habit. And we're living in a society with so many triggers and pulls that you have to develop a ton of positivity and a ton of positive conditioning to be able to stay strong. And so you know that you shouldn't eat red dye 40, but if you want to be successful, let's say on a diet, then I know that I need to like make it a lifestyle, that I need to like be listening to like health podcasts and like doing little weird things. And when I do that, I'm much more successful in the long run. And so that's what kind of Don Quixote is. It's this long, meandering, almost reflection on what's important in life. And honestly, that's what most novels should be about. Like there should be the occasional doomsday exploration of why everything sucks, and that's cool to read. But in general, I find myself more and more inclined to novels like this. So last on our list is Demons by Dostoevsky. And this isn't his longest novel by any means, but people talk, this is one of his lesser read works. But I think one of his most profound and not talked about. So let's talk about it. So this one is kind of a negative through positive reflection. There are novels sometimes that you read. Cormac McCarthy has some good ones like this, where you read it and you're like, damn, I don't want to be like this. And it makes you actually positive. You're like, okay, I'm going to shift this way, or I'm glad I'm going this way. And in The Demons, Piotr, one of the main characters, says, Peter, I don't know, sorry for the Russian. He says, the thing is, I'm just a crook, not a socialist. Our goal is destruction. Pure, merciless destruction. And so in The Demons, we were faced with some of the more nihilistic explorations in all of Dostoevsky's work. And what makes that important is that there's always a thread of redemption in Dostoevsky, and he does it in such a way that provides that. It provides a nice space for you to explore these malignant archetypes, but not get lost in it, because that's what happens. Now with everyone becoming a talk or everyone getting sucked into whatever digital mechanism, people get stuck far too long in certain archetypes. And so I'm sure you guys have seen the archetype wheel before. Every archetype has a malignant aspect, though, that needs to be explored. So, the hero is also the villain. The creator is the destroyer. The everyman, when things go bad, becomes the follower. The jester becomes the hater. The sage, the wisdomatic sage, can easily become an elitist. But in terms of individuating and becoming a real human, you have to explore not just the positive archetypes, but the negative ones. And you don't have to go live it out. You don't have to go be a tyrant. But I think it's so valuable to do this. For instance, all of us have a tyrant within us. All of us at times do that. And so if you think, let's say, Donald Trump sucks and you think he's a tyrant, or Kamala Harris or Joe Biden is a tyrant, or whatever, instead of reacting and getting sucked into the BS of day-to-day politics, you could explore, well, what tyrannical aspects am I showing in the world? How am I like these people? And by doing that, you actually get a more positive reflection of reality, and you can kind of safely explore that within your own active imagination than necessarily living it. And you can look at your life and see how you've lived as a tyrant before. So what is also great about this novel is Dostoevsky's exploration of ideological fanaticism. What happens when you go too deep? Because anytime someone becomes too religious, too leftist, too rightist, or whatever we want to call it, it ruins their empathy. It ruins the nuance and the humility. I remember, it hit me in my soul, but I remember Will Durant saying, when you can, like he went on this paragraph saying, like, when you can overcome being a socialist and an anarchist and all these things, then you'll understand like the lessons of history. And it made me sit and be like, yeah, that's true. Like, even though I like being radical, and I think at times you need to be, and because consensual reality is becoming more normy, then, otherwise normal opinions in the 20th century are now seen as just absolutely insane. Nonetheless, this is a great exploration of what happens when you go too far. And that always leads to, these questions then lead to this idea of moral responsibility and what you need to do when you see this happening, when you see absolutists ruling, maybe not just society, but even a family or a relationship. Because humans are inherently emotional and spiritual beings. We are all on this existential journey. And so being a logic bro and trying to engage with logic, whether to convince people not to be an absolutist or whatever, will never work. It always comes from the heart. When someone deconverts, I know a lot of people who have left the LDS church, and a lot of the time it starts not, they maybe are like, there's a lot of weird stuff in here, I don't know about that, but they don't care. But it's when they emotionally start connecting to the idea that, wow, these dudes were like getting with 14-year-old girls and like manipulating families to get with their daughters. And they start feeling the emotional pull. And then they start seeing how that same ideology has been inflicted upon them and people they know still on the ground today. That's when the emotional kind of storm starts. That's when real change happens. And so I'm going to end the video there, everyone. I want to thank each and every one of you guys for being here. This was one of my longer videos in a hot minute. Expect more of these. My summer is coming up. I only got 4 more weeks of school or so, and then I can finally sit down all day and talk about books.